At the wedding, I accidentally spilled a glass of wine on my daughter-in-law's mother's $50,000 dress. My daughter-in-law immediately slapped me and shouted, "Useless old woman. Clean it now." My son just laughed. I walked away without saying a word. But that moment didn't just ruin the wedding. It shattered something inside me that I didn't even know could break. My name is Evelyn Hart, and at 65 years old, I thought I had seen enough of life to survive any humiliation. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for that night. The ballroom was glowing with warm light from chandeliers that sparkled like stars. Tables were dressed in ivory silk, with crystal centerpieces that probably cost more than my monthly pension. I wore my best navy blue dress, the one I saved for special occasions. Even so, it looked plain among all those glittering gowns. I kept smoothing the skirt, hoping I wouldn't embarrass my son, Daniel. He stood tall and handsome in his tuxedo, dark hair perfectly styled, but when his eyes met mine across the room, there was no warmth. Just distance. The accident happened during the toasts. My hands were trembling slightly as I held a glass of red wine, trying to stay steady. Then someone brushed past me, and the wine leapt from my glass in slow motion, a crimson arc landing right across Margaret's gown. Margaret, my daughter-in-law Sophie's mother, gasped as if I had shot her. Sophie screamed, $50,000, and rushed to her mother's side. People stopped talking. Music faded in the background. Margaret's face twisted with disgust as she looked at the spreading stain. "You clumsy old woman," Sophie's voice cut like a knife. She didn't stop there. Her palm cracked across my cheek so hard I stumbled back. The sound of it echoed like a slap to the whole room. "Don't touch her," Sophie barked when I reached for napkins. "You've done enough. Clean it now." I froze, my cheek burning, my heart hammering in my ears. The 100 or so guests stared at me like I was filth on the floor. And then came the moment that hurt far worse than the slap. Daniel laughed. Not nervously, not to break tension. No, he genuinely laughed, as if my public humiliation was entertainment. "Mom's always been a klutz," he announced. "Remember when she dropped my birthday cake? Some things never change." Something inside me didn't just break. It died. I knelt down and picked up the broken glass pieces with shaking hands, cutting myself on the shards. No one offered to help. No one defended me. Margaret finally said, "The cleaning bill will be sent to you," her voice dripping with disdain. I nodded without looking up. What could I say? That my entire income came from Social Security? That $50,000 was more than I'd ever held in my life? When I finally stood, blood beading on my palm, I saw Daniel with his arm around Sophie, comforting her like she had been the one attacked. Conversations resumed around me, whispers floating. Embarrassing. Why was she even invited? I walked toward the exit, legs unsteady, my face hot with shame. At the coat check, the young attendant handed me my worn jacket with a sympathetic smile that somehow made it worse. The drive home blurred. I didn't remember the turns or the lights. I only remembered parking in my driveway, sitting in the dark with the engine running, wondering if I even had the strength to walk inside. The silence of my small house pressed against me like a weight. My living room was filled with photos of Daniel. School pictures, graduations, birthdays. All the moments I had been behind the camera, never in front of it. I sank onto the couch, staring at the wedding invitation still on the mantel. The elegant lettering that once made me proud now mocked me. I wasn't a guest of honor. I had been tolerated. That night, sleep didn't come. My mind replayed the slap, the laughter, the shame. And then the memories began to shift. Other moments, other small cruelties I had brushed aside over the years. The wedding hadn't been the start. It had been the final straw. I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, my cheek still stinging from Sophie's slap, my ears still ringing from Daniel's laugh. It wasn't just humiliation. It was a cold, crushing realization that my son didn't see me as his mother anymore. He saw me as nothing. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. Where had I gone wrong? Daniel's father left when he was only 6. I can still see that morning, suitcase by the door. His father saying he wasn't cut out for family life. I had no words to explain to my little boy why his daddy wasn't coming back, so I lied. I told him it was a business trip. That lie grew each day until it became our reality. From that moment on, I promised myself I'd give Daniel a life where he'd never feel abandoned again. I worked double shifts at the factory, my hands cracked from the chemicals, my feet aching so badly I'd cry in the shower at night so Daniel wouldn't hear me. When he needed new shoes for school, I wore my old ones for another year. When he wanted to play Little League, I sold my grandmother's necklace to buy the gear. I gave him piano lessons, summer camps, even started a college fund, everything I never had. But somewhere along the way, my sacrifices stopped feeling like gifts to him. They became expected. Ordinary. Invisible. I remember his high school graduation. I'd saved for months to buy him a nice watch, a symbol of my pride. I imagined him wearing it to job interviews, remembering his mother's love every time he checked the time. But when I gave it to him, he barely glanced at it. "Thanks, Mom," he mumbled, shoving it into his pocket before running to join his friends. Weeks later, I found it still wrapped, forgotten under a pile of cards. College was worse. He wanted to go out of state, but my savings could only stretch so far. So I mortgaged the house, picked up weekend cleaning jobs, and lived on peanut butter sandwiches so he could afford his textbooks. When he brought Sophie home in his junior year, I knew instantly she didn't approve of me. Her eyes swept over my small living room, the mismatched furniture, the off-brand groceries in the kitchen. She was polite, but her compliments were sharp-edged. "Your mother is so dedicated," she told Daniel, making the words sound like a flaw. From then on, Sophie worked quietly, subtly. Never outright insults. She was too clever for that. But little comments here and there about elevating your circle, about healthy boundaries, and independence. I could see Daniel changing. Calls became shorter, visits less frequent. When I asked about his life, he'd tell me I wouldn't understand the pressures of his new world. Still I kept giving. I kept helping. I kept believing that one day he'd remember who I was to him. And then came the wedding. And that slap. And that laugh. Now, lying in the dark, I realized it had all been leading here. Not by accident but by design. 3 days after the wedding, I still hadn't heard from Daniel. Not a call to check if I was okay. Not even a text. At first, I told myself maybe he was busy, wrapped up in honeymoon plans. But deep down, I knew the truth. He wasn't thinking about me at all. The silence inside the house felt heavier than usual. I couldn't look at his childhood photos without my stomach turning. Every smile, every milestone, now seemed like proof of how blind I'd been. I kept moving from room to room, trying to outrun the thoughts, but they followed me everywhere. That's when I decided to clean the spare bedroom. An old storage space I hadn't touched in years. It was stuffed with boxes, some half collapsed under their own weight, others stacked so high they almost reached the ceiling. I figured sorting through it would keep my hands busy and my mind occupied. I started with the closet, pulling down boxes covered in dust. Most of it was junk. Yellowed receipts, outdated warranties, greeting cards from people I barely remembered. But then, pushed way to the back behind a stack of Daniel's old science fair projects, I found a box labeled in my handwriting. Financial records. I felt a strange chill as I lifted the lid. Inside were neatly stacked folders, each one holding documents from years of loans and gifts I had given Daniel. The first paper made my breath catch, a signed note, written in his handwriting. I, Daniel Hart, agree to repay my mother, Evelyn Hart, the sum of $20,000 within 6 months, with 3% interest. My hands started to tremble. This wasn't a gift. This wasn't me investing in his future. This was a formal loan with clear terms. Terms he had never honored. I dug deeper. There it was, the $45,000 for his house down payment, the $15,000 for the honeymoon. He had even written loan in the memo line on some of the checks. And then I found the document that nearly stopped my heart. A mortgage application where he had listed personal loan from E. Hart, $80,000. $80,000. He had acknowledged the debt to the bank, used it to look more financially stable, but never mentioned it to me. I sat on the bedroom floor surrounded by paper, the weight of betrayal pressing down like a stone on my chest. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't a misunderstanding. This was calculated. For years he had been using me like a bank, knowing exactly which strings to pull, which words would make me open my wallet. And the worst part? I had believed every word. Every time. As I sat there, staring at the numbers, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't sadness anymore. It wasn't even heartbreak. It was anger. Clean, sharp, and righteous. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about how to make peace with Daniel. I was thinking about how to make this right. The papers were still scattered across the bedroom floor when the sky outside turned from pale gray to dark blue. I hadn't eaten all day, hadn't turned on the TV, hadn't answered a single call. I just sat there, reading and rereading every loan agreement, every check copy, every promissory note in Daniel's handwriting. It wasn't just the money. It was the pattern. Every time he had come to me, he'd known exactly how to play me. He'd lean in, soften his voice, and say something like, "Mom, I hate to ask, but Sophie's been having health problems. We need a specialist, and insurance won't cover it. It's just until we get back on our feet." I remembered one time in particular. 3 years ago. He had sat at my kitchen table, hands clasped, looking so concerned. I'd believed him instantly. Without a second thought, I'd emptied my savings account, $25,000, because he made it sound like life or death. 2 weeks later, I saw pictures on Sophie's social media. They were in Napa Valley, smiling over glasses of wine at a luxury resort that probably cost more per night than my grocery budget for a month. When I asked Daniel about it, he didn't even flinch. "Oh, that was a gift from Sophie's parents," he said. "They thought we needed a break from all the stress." And I believed him. Again. Because the alternative, that my own son could lie to me so easily, was too painful to face. Now, sitting there with all this proof in my lap, the truth couldn't be avoided. It was calculated. Planned. Over 15 years, I had given Daniel more than $130,000. My life savings. My retirement. The small dreams I had kept tucked away, like maybe traveling to Europe one day or finally fixing the back porch. All of it was gone. But the part that kept me awake wasn't the money. It was the realization that he'd studied me. He knew my weaknesses. He knew I carried guilt over his father leaving. He knew I still wanted to feel useful, wanted to believe I mattered in his life. And he had turned those things into weapons. I felt the heat rising in my chest. It wasn't the shaky, wounded anger I'd felt at the wedding. This was steady. Solid. The kind that sits deep in your bones. By the next morning, I knew what I had to do. I opened my laptop and searched for lawyers in my area who specialized in family financial disputes, especially cases involving older parents. That's when I found Margaret Henderson and Associates. The office was in a converted old Victorian downtown, not one of those intimidating glass towers where Daniel worked. Margaret's profile picture showed a woman about my age, silver hair, kind eyes. I called and made an appointment. Walking into her office felt strange, like I was betraying some unspoken rule about family loyalty. But when I spread the documents across her desk, Margaret didn't look shocked. She looked familiar with this. She read everything slowly, making small notes on a yellow legal pad. When she finally looked up, her eyes were sharper than before. "Mrs. Hart," she said, "this is excellent documentation. Your son was very thorough in creating a paper trail." I swallowed hard. "Is that good or bad for me?" "It's very good," she said firmly. "These aren't gifts, no matter what he's told you. They are documented loans with specific terms. In the eyes of the law, he owes you this money." She picked up a calculator and started tapping. "Based on what I see here, the outstanding debt is about $83,000. And that's without counting the undocumented gifts or adding interest." 83,000. Hearing it out loud felt like someone had dropped a weight on my chest. "What are my options?" I asked. "We can start with a formal demand letter, giving him 30 days to arrange payment or a payment plan. If he refuses or ignores it, we can file a civil lawsuit. With this documentation, I'm confident about your chances." She paused. "If you do nothing, he keeps the money, and he'll likely keep asking for more." I thought of Sophie's hand across my face. I thought of Daniel laughing. I thought of sitting alone in my car after the wedding, too numb to move. "If I do this," I whispered, "there's no going back. He'll never forgive me." Margaret studied me for a moment. "Can I ask you something? When was the last time your son did something that required your forgiveness?" The question hit me like a punch. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. I couldn't remember the last time Daniel had apologized to me. Not once. "You're not destroying a relationship," Margaret said gently. You're setting a boundary. Right now, you're not his mother. You're his victim. Is that really what you want to be? Her words stayed with me. Victim. That's what I'd been. And for the first time in years, I didn't want to be. I signed the retainer agreement, my hand shaking only slightly. Margaret would start with the demand letter. Daniel would have 30 days to respond. As I walked back to my car, the winter sun seemed brighter. The air felt cleaner. I wasn't confused anymore. I had a plan. And this time, I wasn't going to apologize for taking up space in my own life. I drove home from Margaret's office with a manila folder of documents on the passenger seat, my fingers gripping the steering wheel tighter than they needed to. My body was still tense, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from something I hadn't felt in years, resolve. When I walked into the house, the first thing I noticed was how much of it was Daniel. His pictures were everywhere. Smiling in kindergarten, holding up a trophy at 12, in his graduation gown, in a suit at his first job. Each one had once been a piece of my pride, proof of the life I'd built for him. Now, they felt like trophies of his ability to take and take without giving anything back. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't pace the floor waiting for his call. Instead, I started making changes. Small, deliberate ones. First, I called my bank and set up automatic bill pay for every expense I had. I'd spent years keeping my phone by my side, volume on high, because I didn't want to miss a call from Daniel if he needed me. Now, I didn't want him to have any reason to think I needed him. Next, I changed my emergency contact at every place that had his name. My doctor's office, the insurance company, even the pharmacy. I put down Helen, my neighbor. She was practical, kind, and most importantly, she wouldn't treat a crisis like an opportunity to make me feel like a burden. Then I opened my freezer and threw away every casserole I'd been saving for when Daniel visited. He hadn't eaten a meal I'd cooked in years, always claiming he and Sophie were on some new diet. The hardest change was the photos. I didn't remove all of them, I wasn't ready for that, but I took down most. The mantel looked bare without them, but for the first time in a long time, the living room started to feel like my space again, not a shrine to someone who didn't think I was worth a phone call. The phone itself was my last act of defiance. I turned it to silent at 9 every night and didn't check it again until after my morning coffee. The first night, I felt strange, almost reckless, like I was breaking some rule of motherhood. But by the third night, I realized I was sleeping better than I had in years. 1 week later, Margaret called to say the demand letter was ready. She read it to me over the phone, her voice firm and professional. Dear Mr. Hart, this letter serves as formal demand for payment of outstanding loans made by your mother, Evelyn Hart, between 2010 and 2024. Based on documentation in our possession, you currently owe Mrs. Hart $83,247 in principal, plus applicable interest. You have 30 days from receipt of this letter to contact our office to arrange payment or establish a payment plan. Failure to respond will result in civil action to recover the debt. It sounds so official, I said. That's the point, Margaret replied. This isn't a family discussion anymore. It's a business matter. And she was right. Somewhere along the way, without me realizing it, my relationship with Daniel had become a transaction. I provided the capital, and he provided nothing in return. The letter went out by certified mail the next day. I knew exactly when he would receive it, exactly when the 30-day clock would start ticking. And for the first time in years, I made plans that had nothing to do with him. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center. I made a doctor's appointment I'd been putting off because I hadn't wanted to ask him for a ride. I bought groceries for one instead of keeping my pantry stocked for the off chance he might visit. The silence from his end didn't feel like abandonment anymore. It felt like space. Room to breathe. Room to remember who I was before I became just Daniel's mom. 3 days before Daniel was set to receive the letter, my phone rang. It was Helen. Evelyn, honey, there's a young woman sitting in your driveway in a white BMW. Says she's your daughter-in-law. I told her you were at the store, but she's been there over an hour. Sophie. I wasn't at the store. I was 2 blocks away, sipping coffee at the little cafe I'd started going to in the afternoons. Thanks, Helen, I said. I'll be home in a bit. But I didn't rush. I finished my coffee slowly, read another page of the book I'd brought, and only then drove home. When I pulled into the driveway, Sophie was leaning against her car, scrolling on her phone with the kind of studied boredom people use when they want to look unaffected. When she looked up, I saw something new in her eyes. Uncertainty. "Evelyn," she said, her voice overly bright, "I was hoping we could talk." I took my time getting out of the car, letting her watch me move at my own pace. "About what? The wedding? What happened?" She tucked a strand of her perfect blonde hair behind her ear. "I think there might have been some misunderstandings." I unlocked my door and stepped inside, leaving it open for her to follow. She did, her heels clicking against the hardwood. She looked out of place in my modest living room, surrounded by my mismatched furniture and the quiet comfort of a house that had been lived in. "Water?" I asked. She nodded, perching on the edge of the couch like she was afraid to touch it. I took my time in the kitchen, filling a glass and adding a few crackers to a plate I knew she wouldn't eat. When I returned, she glanced around, her eyes lingering on the few photos of Daniel I hadn't taken down. "So many pictures of him," she said. "You must miss having him around." I smiled slightly. "Actually, I've been keeping busy. Taking classes. Reading more. It's amazing how much time you have when you're not worrying about other people's problems." Her smile faltered. "That's good. Self-care is important." She shifted in her seat. "Between us, I think Daniel feels terrible about what happened. He's just too proud to say it." I leaned back, studying her. "What exactly does he feel terrible about?" "Laughing when you slapped me?" The color drained from her face. "That's not." "Because I'm curious," I said evenly. "What part of that does he regret?" For the first time since I'd met her, Sophie didn't have a quick answer. And I knew then, she wasn't here to apologize. She was here because they knew something was coming. I didn't have to wait long before the sound of tires crunching on my driveway filled the room. Through the window, I saw Daniel's car pull in. His movements were sharp, purposeful. He was here to manage the situation. "You called him," I said to Sophie without looking at her. It wasn't a question. She shifted uncomfortably. "I thought it might be better if we were all together." The front door opened without a knock. Daniel walked in like he still had the right, scanning the room. I could see it in his eyes. He'd expected to find Sophie crying, me apologizing, maybe even promising to forget whatever little fight we'd had. Instead, I was sitting in my chair, perfectly calm, my legs crossed, holding my tea like I had all the time in the world. "Mom," he said, his voice even, almost rehearsed. "Sophie said you two were talking." "We were," I replied. "About her apology." "I'm still waiting to hear it." His jaw tightened. "I think we're all a little emotional. Maybe we should take a step back." "I'm not emotional," I said. "I'm calmer than I've been in years." He moved behind the couch, placing his hands on Sophie's shoulders, a little display of solidarity. "Look, what happened at the wedding was unfortunate. Accidents happen, and we all react differently under stress." "Accidents happen," I repeated slowly, like I was tasting the words. "Yes, spilling the wine was an accident. But slapping me? Laughing at me? That was a choice." Daniel's mouth twitched, but he kept his voice measured. Everything else was just reaction in the moment. I stood. Both of them seemed to shrink back slightly. "You know what, Daniel? You're right. Accidents happen. Like me accidentally finding some very interesting documents while I was cleaning this week." Something flickered in his eyes. He tried to keep his face neutral, but his shoulders stiffened. "What kind of documents?" "Oh, nothing special," I said casually. "Just a few old loan agreements, promissory notes. Things I'd forgotten I'd kept. Funny how different they look when you read them with fresh eyes." Daniel's skin paled, and I could almost see the calculations spinning in his head. How much did I know? What would I do with it? How much trouble was he in? Sophie looked between us, clearly sensing the tension but not understanding the full picture. "Mom, if this is about money." "Money," I interrupted, letting my voice go sharp for the first time. "Why would it be about money? You've made it very clear that family doesn't keep score." Silence stretched across the room. Sophie's fingers tightened on Daniel's hand. "Maybe we should continue this conversation another time," Daniel said finally. I gestured toward the door. "You're welcome to leave any time." It was the first time in 2 decades I'd dismissed my own son from my home. Sophie stood abruptly. "I think we should go," she said to him. Daniel hesitated, clearly wanting some kind of reassurance that I'd go back to being the pliable mother he was used to. "We'll talk soon," he said, his voice forced. "Will we?" I asked. "You haven't called me in 3 weeks, but now we'll talk soon?" They left without another word. I stood by the window, watching them argue next to their cars. Daniel kept gesturing toward my house, frustration etched into every movement. 10 minutes later, my phone started ringing, his name flashing on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. And again. I turned the phone off and went back to my tea. 3 days later, Margaret called to confirm that the demand letter had been delivered. By 11:15 a.m., my phone was ringing non-stop. The first voicemail was angry. "Mom, what the hell is this?" The second was urgent. "We need to talk about this." The third was desperate. "If you don't call me, I'm coming over." By Wednesday, he was pounding on my front door. I stayed in the kitchen, making lunch, listening to the knocks echo through the house. Helen peeked over from her yard, watching. When Daniel spotted her, he straightened his shirt and tried to act casual. "Have you seen my mother today?" "She's not receiving visitors," Helen called back. The next day, Sophie showed up again, this time with tears streaming down her face, makeup smudged. She stood in my driveway in a designer dress that probably cost more than my entire monthly budget. "You're destroying our family," she sobbed. I opened the window just enough to speak through. "The same way you destroyed my dress at your wedding?" Her crying stopped instantly. "That's not the same thing." "You're right," I said. "Your dress was worth $50,000. I'm only asking for 83. Seems like a bargain." I closed the window and went back to my watercolor painting. By Friday, the deadline, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Hart," a man said. "This is David Brennan from Brennan and Kowalski. I'm representing your son in this matter." They had hired a lawyer. "You'll need to speak to my attorney," I told him. "Margaret Henderson. Perhaps we can resolve this privately," he said smoothly. "Family disputes are better handled outside the courts." "Mr. Brennan, my son stopped being family the moment he laughed while his wife assaulted me. Now, he's just someone who owes me money." I hung up. When I told Margaret they'd brought in a lawyer, she sounded almost pleased. "That tells us they know they're caught," she said. The following Monday, we filed the civil suit. The lawsuit moved forward faster than I'd expected. Margaret was a force. Calm, methodical, and relentless. I think that's what unnerved Daniel the most. He was used to me backing down after a show of anger. Used to me softening the moment he looked hurt or upset. But this time, every message, every question, every demand went through Margaret, and I didn't have to hear his voice at all. That didn't stop him from trying to get to me. First came the guilt letters. Handwritten, dramatic pages about how I was destroying his marriage and ruining his reputation at work. I didn't reply. Then came the calls from relatives. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in years called out of nowhere, her tone syrupy sweet. "Evelyn, dear, Daniel's under so much stress. Surely there's another way to handle this." I didn't answer her either. Mother's Day rolled around in the middle of it. Daniel showed up on my porch with flowers, smiling like a little boy bringing home a school project. "Can we just talk, Mom?" he said through the screen door. I shook my head and walked away. It was 8 long months before we had our settlement conference. 8 months of Margaret handling every attempt he made to spin the story. 8 months of me quietly rebuilding my life in ways I hadn't realized I needed. The conference was held on a gray February morning in a sterile room downtown. I wore my navy dress, the same one from the wedding. This time, I wore it as armor. Daniel was already seated when I walked in, looking smaller somehow. Not physically but in presence. Stress lines marked his forehead, and his hair had started to gray at the temples. He still had that expensive suit though. His lawyer started with a lowball. "My client is prepared to offer $30,000 to settle this matter and put it behind both families." Margaret didn't flinch. Full amount owed plus interest and attorney fees. $97,412. Daniel went pale. "That's impossible. I don't have that kind of cash." "You had it when you took it from your mother," Margaret replied coolly. "Figure it out." The negotiation dragged on for 6 hours. Daniel tried bargaining, tried playing the victim, even tried reminding me of all the good times. But I didn't waver. In the end, he agreed. $50,000 immediately, the rest in $2,000 monthly payments for 2 years. His house would serve as collateral. As we signed the papers, Daniel looked at me with something new. Respect. Not love, not warmth, but the grudging respect you give an opponent who has finally proven themselves capable of standing toe-to-toe with you. Was it worth it? He asked quietly. Destroying our relationship over money? I met his gaze without blinking. I didn't destroy anything, Daniel. I just stopped pretending it existed. The first payment arrived exactly on schedule. Then the second. Then the third. Which told me something I had suspected all along. He'd always had the money. He just never intended to pay it back until he had no choice. I used the first $50,000 to do something I'd dreamed about for decades. I booked a month-long trip to Ireland. I stayed in little bed and breakfasts, wandered through green hills, and explored stone castles older than my country. Nobody there knew me as Daniel's mother. They just saw me, Evelyn. One night in County Cork, I met Eleanor, a retired schoolteacher traveling alone for the first time since her husband died. We spent 3 days exploring together, laughing like old friends. When she mentioned she might visit America, I invited her to stay with me. You have family in California? She asked. I have a son, I said. But we're not close. It was the first time I'd said it without feeling ashamed. 6 months later, Eleanor came to visit. We toured wine country, hiked in national parks, and learned that friendship in your 60s can be richer than it ever was in your 20s. The payments kept arriving. We never spoke. And every check was a quiet victory. Not for the money, but for the fact that I had done something I never thought I could. I had held my son accountable. A year after the settlement, Helen mentioned she'd seen Daniel's car pass my house a few times, but he never stopped. Maybe he wants to reconcile, she said gently. Maybe, I replied. But reconciliation requires more than missing what you've lost. I wasn't angry anymore. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind something calmer, steadier, acceptance. I accepted that Daniel was capable of treating me no better than a stranger. I accepted that my love hadn't been enough to make him a good man. I accepted that some relationships can't be fixed, only survived. And I survived. Life after the settlement felt lighter. Not in a dramatic fireworks kind of way. It was more like a heavy coat I'd been wearing for years had finally been taken off, and I could move without feeling weighed down. The first few months, I kept expecting the old habits to creep back in. The urge to keep my phone within arm's reach at all times, the reflex to check if Daniel had called, the worry that maybe I'd gone too far. But they didn't. Instead, I started filling my days with things that had nothing to do with him. My watercolor class became something I looked forward to every week. My teacher, a soft-spoken woman named Ruth, kept telling me my paintings had feeling, which I took as the highest compliment. I planted flowers in the backyard, bright marigolds, lavender, and roses, and found myself actually enjoying mornings, sitting outside with my coffee and watching the sun crawl over the fence. There was no big moment when I got over what Daniel had done. That kind of betrayal doesn't just fade away like a bruise. But it became part of the background instead of the main thing I thought about every day. Eleanor and I kept in touch constantly. We planned another trip together, this time to Scotland. When she called, our conversations were about train routes and cozy inns, not about who had hurt us or how life had let us down. I realized how rare that was. Having someone in my life who didn't see me as a problem to solve or a resource to use. Every month, Daniel's payment would arrive like clockwork. I'd open the envelope, deposit the check, and file away the receipt in a neat little folder labeled Heart Loan Repayment. I never read the return address too closely, never wondered what his life looked like now. And yet, sometimes on quiet nights, I'd think about him. I'd picture him as the little boy who used to crawl into my lap when he had nightmares, or the teenager whose whole face lit up when he made the winning play in a baseball game. Those memories were bittersweet, like looking at a photo of someone you'll never see again. I didn't hate him. I wasn't sure I ever really could. But I no longer mistook that love for permission to let him hurt me. The more I built a life without Daniel at the center, the more I realized how much I'd given up over the years to make space for him. I'd turned down trips with friends because I thought he might need me. I'd skip things I wanted to buy because I was always saving in case Daniel asks. My calendar, my finances, my energy, everything had been orbiting him. Not anymore. One afternoon, about 18 months after the settlement, Helen came over with a plate of lemon bars and a little smile that told me she had something to say. "Evelyn, I've seen Daniel drive by again," she said gently. "Third time this month. He slows down but never stops." I took a bite of a lemon bar and shrugged. That's his choice. Maybe he wants to make things right. "Maybe," I said. "But wanting isn't the same as doing." We didn't talk about it again. That summer, Eleanor flew in from Dublin and rented a little apartment not far from my house. We spent 2 weeks exploring the coast, visiting art galleries, and even taking a cooking class. It was during one of those classes, while we were kneading dough side by side, that she said something I'll never forget. "You seem lighter this time," she told me. "Like you're finally living for you." And she was right. I was. By the time Daniel's last payment was due, the money was almost an afterthought. It had stopped feeling like a symbol of what he owed me emotionally. It was just a transaction, nothing more. The envelope came on a warm April morning. Inside was the check for the final $2,000 and a single note in his handwriting. "Debt paid in full." I stared at it for a long time. Not because the words meant anything, they didn't, but because they were so small compared to the weight of everything that had come before. Some debts can be paid with money. Others can't. I deposited the check and threw the note away. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in the garden, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold. Somewhere across town, Daniel was living his life without me. And for the first time, I felt, without hesitation, that it was his loss, not mine. I wasn't the woman who had crawled on the ballroom floor picking up glass while 100 people stared. I wasn't the woman who kept her phone on all night just in case her son might need her. I was Evelyn Hart. Painter. Traveler. Friend. Someone who had walked through betrayal and come out the other side standing taller than before. And that was worth more than any check he could ever send. The weeks after that last payment felt strangely quiet, almost like the air after a long storm. I had expected to feel some kind of finality, maybe even a swell of satisfaction, but instead it was more stillness. It wasn't that I didn't care. It was that I had moved so far past the chaos Daniel brought into my life that even the closing of that chapter felt like just another day. I started noticing little things about my life that made me smile. I could open my freezer without seeing a stack of meals, just in case Daniel visits. I could look at my bank account and see numbers that belonged entirely to me. I could spend my mornings painting in the kitchen, the sunlight falling across the table, without wondering if I should be saving my energy for someone else's emergencies. Eleanor and I kept adding pins to our travel map. We had plans for Italy next year. Florence, Venice, Rome. Places I used to only dream about while I was scrubbing factory floors or clipping coupons at the kitchen table. One afternoon, while sorting through a drawer, I found the wedding invitation I'd kept tucked away. I almost laughed at the sight of it. The swirling gold letters, the paper so thick it felt like it was made to outlast time. Back then, I'd thought it was an honor to be invited. Now, I could see it for what it had been. An obligation, extended to me because not inviting me would have made them look bad. I thought about tearing it up, but instead, I slipped it into a folder labeled Lessons Learned. It didn't hurt to see it anymore. It just reminded me how far I'd come. People sometimes asked if I missed Daniel. My answer was always the same. I missed who I thought he was. That boy is gone. The man who replaced him? I don't miss him at all. The truth is, there's a kind of grief in realizing that someone you love is capable of treating you like you don't matter. But there's also freedom in accepting it. Once you stop trying to change someone into the version you wish they were, you can start living for yourself again. Helen came over one evening with her little dog, Max, and we sat on my porch sipping iced tea. She asked, "Do you ever think you'll talk to him again?" "Maybe," I said honestly. "If he ever comes to me without excuses. If he ever says, 'I was wrong and I'm sorry.' But until then, no." She nodded slowly. "You've gotten stronger." I smiled. I didn't have a choice. But I'm glad I did. Later that night, I stood in front of the mirror, studying my own reflection. There were new lines on my face, a softness in my hair where silver had started to show, but my eyes looked alive again. I realized then that the real victory wasn't the money. It wasn't even the trips or the classes or the garden. The real victory was that I had taken my life back. Piece by piece, choice by choice, I had pulled myself out of a place where I was nothing more than a background character in my own story. And now, I was writing it myself. It was a warm autumn afternoon when I realized, fully and completely, that I was no longer living in Daniel's shadow. The sun was pouring into my kitchen, catching the steam from my tea, and the scent of fresh-baked bread filled the air. There was no rush, no tension, no heaviness pressing on my chest. I had learned to live without the constant background noise of wondering what he needed, what I could do to keep the peace, or how much of myself I could give away without completely disappearing. That's when it hit me. Peace doesn't just arrive. You build it. Brick by brick. Choice by choice. And sometimes, the hardest part is taking down the walls you built yourself to keep someone else comfortable. I thought back to that night at the wedding, the cold sting of Sophie's hand on my cheek, the way Daniel's laughter had felt like a blade in my chest. 4 months afterward, I thought the humiliation was the worst part. I thought that moment was the deepest wound. But it wasn't. The real wound was older. Years of letting little cuts go unacknowledged, letting him rewrite the truth, convincing myself it was love when it was manipulation. That's the thing no one tells you about people who use you. They don't start with the big betrayals. They start small. They take a little here, a little there. They make the taking look like giving, so by the time you realize you're empty, it feels like it must be your fault for not having more to give. I remembered every time I'd apologized to him, apologized for not having enough, for asking when he might pay me back, for even existing in ways that didn't fit into his new life. Each apology had been a small surrender. Each one had taught him he could push further without consequences. Not anymore. The lawsuit, the settlement, the payments, those were the visible changes. But the real transformation happened in the quiet moments after. Learning to sit in my garden without waiting for a car to pull into the driveway. Learning to look at my phone without hoping for his name to appear. Learning to spend my money and my time on things that brought me joy, not just on keeping the peace with someone who saw me as a resource instead of a mother. And most importantly, learning that I didn't need to be needed to have worth. Eleanor had been a huge part of that. Traveling with her reminded me that the world was still full of beauty, adventure, and connection. Things I'd once believed were out of reach for me. Our friendship was effortless, built on laughter and mutual respect, not on obligation or guilt. One evening, as we sat by the ocean in Monterey watching the sun sink into the horizon, she said, "You know, Evelyn, some people take your energy and never give it back. And some people sit with you, share it, and leave you feeling like you've got more than when you started. You've learned to tell the difference." She was right. That was the lesson. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about getting back every penny Daniel owed me. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself I'd given away without realizing I was doing it. It was about standing up and saying, "I will not be diminished in my own life," and meaning it. The last time I saw Daniel, purely by chance, was at the grocery store. I was reaching for a jar of honey when I heard his voice. I turned, and there he was, a cart half full, wearing the same expensive kind of jacket he'd always favored. For a moment, neither of us moved. "Mom," he said finally, nodding like we were acquaintances. "Daniel," I replied. My voice was calm. He hesitated, maybe expecting me to bridge the gap, to ask how he'd been, to offer some opening. I didn't. I gave him a polite nod and turned back to my cart. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. There was no anger, no sadness. Just the certainty that I didn't need anything from him anymore. When I left the store, I didn't look back to see if he watched me go. That night, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine, the air cool but not cold, the roses still blooming stubbornly despite the season. I thought about the woman I had been, afraid to upset him, willing to sacrifice my own comfort for the smallest scraps of affection. And I thought about the woman I had become, someone who could see clearly, set boundaries, and choose herself without guilt. Here's what I've learned, and what I wish I'd known sooner. Love doesn't mean endless forgiveness. It doesn't mean giving until you're hollow. Real love, healthy love, goes both ways. If someone consistently takes from you without giving back, they don't see you as a person. They see you as a supply. And no matter who they are, child, parent, spouse, you have the right to protect yourself. You don't owe anyone access to your life simply because you've shared blood or history. You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself, is to walk away and close the door. Not out of hate but out of self-respect. If Daniel ever comes to me one day and says, "I was wrong. I'm sorry," I'll listen. But I'll never go back to being the woman who accepted less than basic respect from the person she loved most. That woman is gone. And I don't mourn her. Now my days are filled with things that make me feel alive. Brushes dipped in watercolor, suitcases packed for the next trip, dinners with friends who laugh with me instead of at me. My nights are peaceful. My mornings are mine. I once believed my greatest failure was losing my son. Now, I know my greatest success was finding myself. So if you're listening to this and you've been made to feel small, if you've been told that love means accepting whatever treatment someone decides to give you, hear me. You are allowed to expect better. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to choose yourself. Because in the end, you are the one person you will have for your entire life. And you deserve to be treated with kindness, respect, and love. Even if you're the one who has to give it to yourself. And that is worth more than $50,000 dresses, more than $83,000 debts. More than anything they can take from you.